Frank Dukes is a Canadian music producer that has seriously worked with some of the biggest names in music. He's very well known for his vintage and unique style of sound. So with this, his production style actually involves a lot of variety when it comes to the instruments he's using. So you would usually hear him layer a lot of different sounds, such as guitars, pianos, vintage hardware, and synths. And with all these layers, he tends to give the sounds a lot of different and unique sounding effects that really enhances the texture and the vintage sound of the instruments he's using. So in this video, I want to demonstrate to you guys how you can actually replicate his sound and pretty much a step-by-step process how to recreate his sound in FL Studio. So when it comes to making these Frank Dukes type of samples, there are a couple of things we need to focus on. First things first, we obviously need to think about sound selection. If you actually want to take this a step further, you can actually look at some pictures and videos of Frank Dukes actually playing live instruments, and thereby you can literally use the same exact pianos, keys, guitars, and synths that he is using. But obviously for most of us, we don't really have the type of hardware or instruments that he is using, but luckily we can still achieve his type of sound using similar sounding plugins and also a variety of different and unique effects. So in this case, we're actually just going to use this Verley 5 piano from Analog Lab. I'm just going to be using this Martian Echo preset, but the only switch up I'm going to do is that I'm actually going to turn off this analog delay down here. So I'm going to show you guys how you can recreate a similar sounding chord progression to Frank Dukes. But firstly, let's just take a listen to how the piano sounds without any effects on. So as you guys can hear, it's actually a very simple pattern. So the chords might look a little bit complex, but the pattern is actually super simple to make. The BPM we are working in is actually going to be 135, and the scale I was working in was just C sharp minor. So just to clarify some super simple things, the main chord that is really going is just a C sharp minor chord, but it might look a little bit different since the root note is G sharp down here. This is actually just because we have inverted it down one octave. So if you just pitch it up like this, you'll see it's literally just a normal C sharp minor chord with a D sharp note on top. And then we have literally just copied this over. We have pitched this up over here while we pitch this D sharp down over here. For the third chord, again, it's super simple. We again just copied this chord over, but we pitched this down to the C sharp once again. Now for the last chord, we actually did some slight switch ups. So in this case, we're actually going to copy the same exact second chord over, and this time instead of inverting the G sharp, we are actually going to invert the F sharp down one octave. And for the top note, you can actually pitch it up to whatever note you like. And then lastly, everything I did was just add some accent notes here and there, just to give the chord progression a little bit more movement so it's not super stale. But now one of the most important things when it comes to this chord progression right here is actually if I go a little bit closer on the notes, you can see that they are really strummed out in different ways. This is because Frank Dukes actually plays most of his instruments live, so we really want to get that realistic sound from the pianos we're using. In my opinion, one of the best ways to actually strum these notes, it's either just to strum them manually, or in this case, you can actually do a super cool trick. So the trick I used was actually just to highlight one chord at a time. So I just started off with this chord and I hit Alt S on my keyboard, then I just strummed it a little bit, and then I went into the second chord and again I hit Alt S, but this time I actually strummed it a little bit differently. Then again I went to this chord and strummed it even more than the second one, and then for the last chord again I highlighted it, hit Alt S, but this time you want to strum a little bit less. So just messing around with one chord at a time and seriously adjusting the strumming a little bit here and there makes a huge difference. Now that right there is actually everything you need to know when it comes to the main chord progression. But now to really get that Frank Dukes and vintage sound, we seriously want to focus on the effects. So the first effect I added was just this Wolf compressor over here. I did some slight changes. I turned up the compression a little bit to about 61%. This made the piano super loud, so I also turned the input gain down a little bit. Then I would highly recommend to adjust a little bit of this wow flutter over here. This is really going to get that detuned sound that you would usually hear from Frank Dukes or cubeatz. Now for the lo-fi amount, I actually kept it at 50%, but I actually did turn off the noise over here. The last thing I did for this effect was just turn the mix down to about 70%, just so the compression is not overwhelming. But if you really want to get that vintage type of sound, I highly recommend to pretty much just over compress all your sounds and just use the EQ to really cut out the highs and the lows, just so you pretty much keep the mid frequencies of the sound. For the next effect, I actually added this Abbey Road Chambers effect over here. It is a super nice effect to use, especially when it comes to these type of samples. The reason being is that you really want to make it sound like your instruments are being played in a room. So in this case, I just used this glued piano preset. Originally, it was actually in this chamber room over here, but I actually just switched it over to this stone room because it sounds way better. Just take a listen. You can really hear how the piano already sounds like it's being played in a room. The next effect was just a plain and simple roam. I put it at about 24%, but it's pretty much just a reverb, so you can use any reverb you really like. Then I also added a RC20, just using the Vinyl 2 preset, and you can adjust a little bit of the wall flutter over here as well if you want to get more of that detune sound. The second to last effect we're using is actually this J37. I highly recommend using this effect for saturation, and the main reason that I'm actually using this J37 saturation is actually because I've seen videos of Frank Dukes using the exact same saturation plugin. So if you really want to get that Frank Dukes type of sound, you've got to implement this saturation over here. I made sure to turn off the noise all the way since we have a little bit of the noise from the RC20. Now the last effect is just this EQ. Like I said, you really want to cut out those high frequencies and the low frequencies, pretty much just keeping the mid of the frequency range, because with all the different effects we added earlier, it's going to make it sound super vintage and old. So now let's take a listen to how the piano sounds with all the effects on. So you can hear a huge difference. It already sounds super vintage. The next instrument we're going to add is going to be this guitar from Ample Guitar. This is typically one of these electric guitars that sounds super vintage and old. I think this guitar has been around for a while, so it's going to fit perfectly for these vintage type of samples. So Frank Dukes is very well known for layering his sounds while still keeping the pattern simple. So for this pattern, I've mainly just used the root notes of the main piano we used earlier, but we have actually done some super cool stuff with the effects. Let's just take a listen to how they both sound together. So it's literally just following the root notes, but we have a slight switch up at the end. So like I said, right now we are strictly just focusing on layering. So we're just layering the guitar with the chords, but for the effects, we actually switched it up a little bit. This time I actually started off with a Valhalla vintage verb, but I was actually just using this spacious vocal preset. It's a super nice preset that a lot of people don't know about. So if you want to switch up a little bit of the reverb, make sure you try out this preset over here. But I still wanted a little bit more ambience from the guitar, so I just turned the decay up to about 5 seconds. Then again, we have the J37 tape saturation. This time I'm just using this acoustic guitar preset instead. This fits perfectly because we're obviously using a guitar. Now again, compressing and EQing out those harsh frequencies. So we pretty much have the same type of frequency range from the chords. But a super cool thing I did with the effects for this guitar was I actually opened up Shaperbox. I still haven't got Shaperbox 3. So if you guys have hopped on that, let me know if it's actually worth getting. But I actually went into the time knob and I just put this reverse effect on over here. Although I did put the mix to about 25%, I actually turned it off in the mixer over here and I created this automation clip that kind of switches up the sound. Just take a listen. So you can hear the reverse in the background. I highly recommend to make some automation clips of your effects because they can really change up and enhance the whole sound you're using. It's seriously like small details like this that differentiate producers like Frank Dukes from the rest of the sample makers out there. Now, if you guys have listened to a lot of the samples from the Kingsway Music Library, which is actually a sample collection or library made by Frank Dukes himself, you will actually hear a lot of basses being used. So obviously you guys know we had to add a bass to this sample. Now, to be fair, if you listen to the samples that I just mentioned, you would hear the basses being played live. Now I'm being completely honest, but I actually don't have a bass and I don't even know how to play the bass guitar. So in this case, I just had to open up this Scarby Rickenbacker bass in Contact. It's just the only bass that I actually have except from using one-shots. So in this case, I'm literally just having to use this. But if you guys know actually how to play the real bass guitar, I would highly recommend you guys use that. But obviously, if you don't have anything better, you can just find a plugin like this one and it's gonna sound super nice as well. So here again, we're pretty much just following the root notes of the chords, but we want to add a little bit of more movement and we also want to make the guitar sound a bit realistic. So since I don't know how to play the bass guitar, you kind of want to try to add a little bit of a more realistic type of finger picking style at the end of each bar. So I did this cool little pattern over here at the end. You can see I also shortened the notes a little bit just so it sounds more realistic. And you can also go down over here to the velocity and change a little bit of the voicing. So that guitar at the end is super nice. Now again, we want to continue with the layers of the sample. So just to layer it a little bit more, I opened up this B35 from Analog Lab yet again. This time I'm just using this Church of Zeppelin preset, I think it's called. And the pattern over here again is super simple. We're just layering the chords from the piano, but this time instead of having them extended all the way like this, I just shortened them over here to the first clap pretty much, just so the layer sounds a little bit different from the piano. You can also hear I just pitched it up by 1 octave from the piano chords. Now, I actually really liked how the organ sounded by itself, so all the effects I actually did that was just this Valhalla vintage reverb yet again. But like I said, with the keys, you really want to make it sound like they're being played in a room. So this time I was just using this tiled room preset, as well as another J37, and again that EQ to really cut out those high frequencies to keep the mids exposed. So now we pretty much have the main elements of the sample down, but as you guys can probably hear, it still lacks a little bit of more movement to it. So to really enhance the flow of the sample, I thought about adding some vocals. Now when Frank Dukes actually puts in vocals in his samples, he's obviously not using no arcade or no splice or anything like that. He's of course using his own voice. So as you guys know, I had to bring out the inner sing star in me, and I just quickly laid down this vocal phrase over here. Yes, believe it or not, that is actually me. Now, obviously, I'm going to show you guys the effects I added to this one. But the first thing I actually did was I just double-clicked on the sample and I actually pitched it up by 1 octave. Then I had to add a auto-tune just to pitch it to the right key. And next, I also wanted the vocal to have a little bit of a delay. So I'm just using this H delay from Waves. But I did actually turn the mix down to about 30% over here. We also needed the vocal to be super ambient. So I just added another roam, but this time at about 60%. So I really bumped it up this time to really give that atmosphere to the vocal. Then just this low cut and high cut EQ. And lastly, we have this Pancake 2 plugin, which is a free plugin, by the way. This is literally just to pan the vocal from left to right. And with the rest of the elements, the vocal sounds like this. So the vocal really adds that movement we were looking for. So now with the vocal, we have also added some movement, but still Frank Dukes is literally a master of finding these empty gaps and pockets in the sample that still has rooms to be filled out with some more movement. So the last instrument I added for the sample was actually this electric vintage guitar from Contact. This time I was just using this retro funk preset. And as you guys can see, I was really looking for that room where pretty much nothing is being played. So if you can really find those empty spaces in the sample, you can just add a little bit of that guitar, not too much, but just a little bit, so it really enhances the movement of the whole sample. Let's just take a listen to how the guitar sounds. The effects I added for the guitar are also super important. I started off with this Older Days preset in Guitar Rig 6. Then I also wanted to get a little bit of that detune sound from the guitar. So I added this Chorus preset in Effect Track. And again, just some more room to get that ambience from the guitar. I didn't really focus too much on getting that room sound since we're already using an amp from the Guitar Rig. Then just the EQ and also this imager just to widen out the sound. Then we also just wanted a little bit of a texture in the background. So I just went into my Imperial one-shot kit and I just dragged in this sheep texture over here. With this texture and all the different elements, you can actually also go into the mixer over here. And I know Frank Dukes actually likes to put a lot of his sounds in mono. So you can actually just go into some of these knobs and try to turn them down all the way to the right. So you can see I adjusted a little bit of the texture as well as the guitar and the organ over here. They're not all the way mono, but I did adjust them a little bit to the right. So that right there are pretty much all the elements to the sample. Now let's take a listen to how it sounds. For the second part, I did pitch up the guitar by 1 octave. So that right there is pretty much the whole sample. So now I'm really vibing with this one. So I think we can actually make a super hard-hitting trap beat over this. So let's just quickly add some drums to this. By the way, all the drum sounds I'm using are obviously coming from my Euphoria bundle kit. So if you guys like the sounds you hear, make sure to go check it out. It's on my website, BBMarko.com, or you can just click the first link down below. But just that standard clap pattern. So I quickly just added a MIDI from the pack as well. Just a little bit of a bouncy rim. Yeah, this is kind of fire, to be fair. The 808 is not too busy, but it still adds a punch to the beat. Now let's quickly just layer the 808 with the kick, and that should pretty much be it right there. Yeah, this is kind of fire, I'm not gonna lie. Alright, so I'm quickly just going to do a little bit of an arrangement, and then I'll show you guys the final beat. Alright, so here we have the full beat. So we pretty much have all the elements in the intro.
Shut up, Marko. Marko.
But it drops to the hook. So here we remove the guitar and the vocals, but then we bring them back. Yeah, the vintage guitar in the background is super fire. Then we bring back the bass. Slow it down a little bit. Then the 808. Yeah, this is fire, bro. Then we are pretty much just back to the intro again. Still have that movement in the bass.